Hello, I am your author and host, Michelle Lynn Gaines. Welcome to my place.
I am the author of Forever Changed, The Power of Knowing Jesus, available on Amazon or anywhere books are sold.
Hello, and welcome to Can You Be a Blessed Man and Not Get All Your Blessings? Well, of course. Of course you can be a blessed man or woman and not get all your blessings. This has to do with receiving. And it also has to do with identifying one thing from another, which is discernment. But this also has to do with learning to listen. I think of that man that we talked about in that story, tracked down his roof while the waters were rising, and God sends him a boat and a helicopter and another boat, and he doesn't get in them. But I also think of two Bible stories in particular of men that were very blessed, but did not receive all those blessings, if any. They struggled their whole life kind of warring against it. You know, if there are 15 steps to faith in the kingdom, or however many there are, as King David spoke of steps to elevated faith, I think we can all agree. We come in the kingdom and fall to the foot of the cross as one thing. And as we learn to walk with Jesus, and our view changes, and our perspective changes, and our understanding of ourselves and our relationship with God and the world around us start to change, our perspective will change. So I guess it just comes down to, this is a little different than learning to step into rest in Jesus or allowing Jesus to elevate us above our circumstances. So it's a little bit of a different aspect, but they all tie in as in the same way that we have to learn to trust God. It all comes from the one hinge pin on trusting God. And so it comes down to trusting God. So as we learn to trust God, do you want a little bit of healing, or do you want to be fully healed? Do you want a little bit of blessings, or all the blessings he wants to give you? Do you want a path to be made in front of you, or do you want a whole road to be made in front of you? I think most of us want the whole thing. We want everything God wants to give us. So having said that, how do we receive it? How do we get everything God wants to give us? A full healing, a road to be made in front of us, full financial and health blessings, the total package. So as we've talked about, it's free. Unmerited favor was given to us the day we first believed. It is unearned by man, yet given by God. So I don't have to do more works. I don't have to believe harder. I just have to believe in the right things. And so that's what this 40 days with Jesus is really about, is how to believe in the right things and not to get all caught up in doctrines within inside the church that really turn out to be works, or the outside world and what they say about us. Jesus knew what it was like to be hungry. He knew what it was like to be rejected, not only by base people in general, but the people that he was the closest to. That's what really hurts, isn't it? He knew what it was like to need shelter, physical shelter from the storms in life. He did not need shelter from the inside storms in life as humans do. He came to give that. But he needed shelter from the rain and the thunder, and often stayed in places he came to preach. Jesus never owned anything but the clothes on his back and the rocks that stuck to his shoe. And he was okay with that. Now, as humans really aren't. So when I think of being a blessed man and not getting all your blessings, the first person I think of is, Lot, and then I think of Jacob. Lot was a cousin to Abraham and Sarah. Sorry, a nephew. Lot was a nephew of Abraham's and Sarah. So Abraham by blood. And although Abraham and Sarah have a very long story in the Old Testament, and there's a lot of little stories inside of their longer journey, Lot's story gets the most interesting when he decides he doesn't want to live out in the country anymore with Abraham and Sarah and the tribe of Israel. They always kept apart from the cities. Lot decides he wants to move into the big city. And he takes his family, his wife, and his 3 children, 2 daughters, I believed, and possibly a son. I don't remember how many children. And he moves into the big city, which happens to be Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, where the base, so now this is sounding familiar. The 2 cities the angels would destroy. And so as Lot moves into the big city, the story unfolds of the angels literally visiting Abraham and Sarah, talking about finding righteous men inside the city. And the story goes on about not being able to produce even 50 righteous men. So the angels were going to smite the city. But if you notice here, they wouldn't smite the city as long as Lot, Abraham's nephew, and his family were inside that city. So now the angels leave Abraham and Sarah, and they appear miles away inside the city with Lot and his family, telling them that this city is going to be destroyed by nuclear bombs. Basically, the angels were going to smite the city with fireball, heaven, holy fire, and rain fire down from the sky. And that is exactly what happened. So as the angels come in and they're saying, hey, Lot, we got to get you and your family out. This is what's going to happen. Lot is just not believing them. I don't know what's going on there, but I like Joseph Prince's interpretation of that. You have two angels standing in front of you telling you that this city is going to be destroyed and that they're your evacuation plan. And you're worried about your DVD collection. You're worried about your stuff in this house. And so that's another long story. The story isn't about the angels, but eventually they do grab a hold of Lot's wrist. He just isn't listening. And so 2 days later, they're done talking to him, they're done listening. They grab his wrist, and the whole group just appears outside the city walls. And the holy fire starts to rain down. And the angels that were with Lot tell him and his wife to walk up the mountain, they'll be saved, that God has prepared a place for them up this mountain. Realistically, where there's plenty of food, you guys can survive. Just don't do one thing. Don't look back, no matter what you see and hear. So the angels say, don't look back, no matter what you see and hear. Now, Lot keeps moving. He doesn't turn around. But his wife, hearing all the screams and cries from the city they just left, concerned about her neighbors, looks back. And as the story goes, she was turned to a pillar of salt. So to this day, they have 5-foot-tall pillars of salt in that region of the world, near that mountain. Could it possibly be Lot's wife and other people that were with them that were not mentioned in the Bible? So Lot had to journey on without his wife, and he missed her very much, and his daughters. And they get up to the top of the mountain, and God has this place he prepared for them. And Lot's like, no, I don't want to stay here. I don't want to be in this mountain. I want to go down to the valley. And so the angels take him to the valley that he wanted to live in. But he was very miserable for the rest of his life in that valley. As a matter of fact, the villagers in the valley ran him out. He and his daughters ended up living in a cave alone for the remainder of his decades. Those daughters were very miserable. They had no husbands to find, no people to connect with or be friends with. It was just them and their father. Food was hard, water was scarce, and that story just didn't end real well. It gets a little bit more twisted from there. I will leave you here, because obviously Lot was a very blessed man who just wasn't going to get those blessings. And then I go to Jacob. These are both Old Testament stories way back in Genesis in the very beginning. So Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's a long story there too. Jacob has several stories within stories, and there are 3 Jacobs in the Bible, so it can be a little confusing. Just like King David, he has a long life story written of in the Bible, and many stories within stories. But those are the ones that get a lot of, their whole lifespan is written of in the Bible. Most others just get a little part of their life written into the Bible. And so Jacob fell in love with a girl named Rachel. And she was the youngest daughter of a man, I can't recall his name. And so he agreed with the father, according to the customs in that time, that he would work 7 years for the father to be allowed to marry his daughter. And Jacob did. He worked 7 years for what he thought was going to be Rachel, the woman he was in love with. But the father tricked him and gave him his daughter, but it was the older daughter, Leah. So obviously Jacob was tricked. So they agree after Jacob says, hey, what's going on? I'm in love with your younger daughter, not your older one. And he said, well, we have to marry off the older ones first. So Jacob works another 7 years for Rachel. 14 years Jacob worked and was finally allowed to marry Rachel. Now, I'm sure he was kind to Leah, but he didn't love Leah. He loved Rachel. And as he and Leah went on to have 4 children, he and Rachel didn't have any children. So after marrying Rachel, he decides he's going to take his 2 wives and 4 sons by Leah and move away from the father's lands, and set out on his own. And God honors this. God's got a plan for him. He's going to take him down the road. He's got this great spot picked out. He's just trying to lead Jacob and his ever-growing family to that spot. Only Jacob has different plans. He wants to park and make a stand right here. They get to somewhere along their journey, and Jacob just says, this is where I want to be. Now, on another part of that, a little part of this. So when they left the father's men caught up to them and are very angry that someone had stolen their religious ornament, their religious piece. And the father thought it was Jacob, and he wanted death. He was whoever took his religious piece, his little Buddha or whatever they were into, he wanted their heads. And as Jacob had sworn that none of his people would do that, he didn't do that. He didn't believe in those gods. He was Hebrew. But he wouldn't be that disrespectful either. They were searched, and that figure was found amongst Rachel's possession. And Rachel had taken her father's religious figure because she didn't want to leave, and she was taking it for herself as a memento. But it ultimately cost her life, as Jacob had promised to kill anyone he found with it if it was amongst his people. They were thinking it would be with the guards or the men. It was with Rachel. And so ironically, Jacob had to sacrifice her life over her decision. So, there's a lot we can, and I think with these 2 characters, they were audibly hearing God's voice. They were physically seeing angels because they lived in the time of signs and wonders. They lived at the time where you saw these things. We don't live in the time of signs and wonders. We're highly likely to ever see an angel. And then I go to Gideon. Gideon was written of in the Bible, just a small little story of an angel that comes to bless Gideon. He has been shown favor. Now, I don't know what got in Gideon's head, but he decides to wrestle around all night with this angel in the desert, grabbing its arm, just really physically tussling with this angel, which I'm surprised you could even do. And it says by sunlight, when the sun comes up, they get tired of fighting. The angel flies up and gives Jacob that blessing and flies out of there. That doesn't seem like a man who's receiving very well. That seems like a guy fighting it every step of the way. Now, a lot of times we just can never really know. Are we fighting God's plan? Are we flowing with it? How do we really know? We don't get to talk to God audibly. We talk to God through prayer. He speaks to us inside of our hearts, through his word, and through other people. And you have to be careful about that one. And so you'll know if it's God, because it's been something you've been talking to God about. They're just being used by God to bring you a message. And you'll know if it's just them, or if that's a message from God for you. And so as we walk with Jesus, and we learn to trust him and God, and we walk under unmerited favor, you can't always be sure. Well, Holy Spirit led. I went for an entire year when I got out of college looking for a job. I was really growing depressed. I was getting desperate. And I kept talking to God. I prayed my whole time I was in college for a certain type of job. One that, nothing fancy, nothing high-powered, just an entry-level, money to live on type of a job that never really did come. And it got confusing. It's just like the books I wrote. I wrote 6 novels right before I went to college. And I was working at the time, and I just thought, gee, one of those will work out, and it never did. I never managed to sell many copies because I didn't advertise, didn't have money for advertising. So it's not a question of good or bad. No more than 12 people even read them. And so it's just kind of a situation where, am I missing what God is saying? Or am I just going off all half-cocked thinking that this is going to be the answer when it's not? God tells us that even a blind squirrel crawling around on its belly looking for a nut in the forest will eventually find one. Well, actually, God doesn't say that. But what God says is to stand up, take your position on 2 feet, and walk into the world and perseverance. Learn how to not be thrown and tossed by every circumstance and every wind. Jesus doesn't want to see us crawl around on our bellies like a blind squirrel in the forest. But when we do, Jesus will help pick us up, elevate us, and take us to that nut. So it can be confusing as to what God has for us. And it's not always, He's not a genie. It's not a magic genie. And I can tell you one thing about humans: as soon as He solves one of our problems, we come up with a list of 5 more. When I didn't have a home, God brings me to a home. You get out of a homeless shelter and into an apartment or into a home. That's a blessing. You'd think just because God got Lot and his family out of the city before they destroyed it, that would be the one thing He'd have to do. Highly favored, highly blessed. But Lot had, 150 more things he was going to need from God. I don't even know how He deals with us sometimes. I am a woman of few needs, but I'm a woman of many needs when it comes to God. Each year of my life, I have financial challenges, food challenges. There's a lot to it. My own emotions, mental health. Really staying in tune with God. It takes a dedicated purpose, but then again, it's really easy. It just flows. And I don't have to worry about every little thing. I just give it to God. And I've learned not to take it back. I've learned to change the things that I can change. I've learned to do the footwork in my own life. And I've learned to give the rest to God. Those things I can't control, I give them to God. Because I cannot control the universe. I can't even control other people. Half the time I can barely control myself and my reaction to everything around me. And so I've learned to temper my tongue, temper my insides, bridle my tongue, listen more than I talk. And I've learned to know that I don't have all the answers. As people don't always want the answers. They just want a listening ear and someone who won't judge them. And maybe speak a little bit of God's love on them. Speak edification unto them instead of condemning them like they already feel when they come and talk to you. Chances are your spouse is having a hard time. Instead of adding to that, maybe we could be the thing that lifts them up that day. Maybe we could say kind things to them or let them know that we still see them in a favorable light. And if they would do the same for us, or maybe even our children, or just a pet in your life. If we don't learn to enjoy the small things in life, you're going to miss it all. Life is not about climbing some corporate ladder, even though a lot of us want to find success. Life is not about having everything you want. It's about having everything you need. Thank you for joining me for The Blessed Man Not Getting All Your Blessings.